Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we are going to be assembling our slippers. So I'm going to start with the finished upper, which is where we ended. I ended in my last video. So what I need to do is to join up the long skinny part that is the side and back to the vamp. I am going to really quickly just count my stitches over the top to make sure that I have them even from side to side. I don't want one side to attach higher than the other, so I just want to make sure visually it looks right. And then what I'm going to do is use my big yarn needle, and I'm going to take that long tail that I left with my yellow yarn, and I am going to, holding my two pieces flat together, I am going to backstitch through both layers right under the V-stitch that is the top of the single crochet stitch. This is not always the normal way to seam things in crochet or knit items, but this way I will be able to retain the rib structure that comes with doing the stitching only through the back loop, and I want to make my join as invisible as possible, so that's how I'm going to do it with this. Once that is done, I am also going to deal with all of the rest of my yarn ends, or at least I should. I was lazy and did not. Now let's talk about the soles of these slippers. Down in the description box, I have a link to the PDF for this pattern, which you can see right here. I will note that the pattern itself is multicolored. I just only have black and white ink right now. So these are not sized in numbers the way shoes normally are, because they don't really quite correspond to shoe sizes for this shape. Instead, what you're going to do is take the trace of your own foot that you made, which I went over in the last video, and you're going to basically see which size is the biggest one possible that will fit within your foot shape. For me, that is size F on my little pattern list. And while I am tracing it into this, you don't necessarily need to do that. I just want to help make it clearer to see why I am picking the one that is, or that I am picking the one that is just barely smaller than my foot. So to actually use this pattern, you can just cut it straight out once you figure out what size you need. I actually cut another one out in a cover stock, which is heavier than regular printer paper, but it's not quite as heavy as like a business card stock paper. But basically I just wanted something a little heavier than printer paper for what's coming next. And I have marked little notches for my center front and my center back because I will need to know those as I am attaching my sole to my slipper upper. These are also straight lasted. There is no difference between left and right, so you don't need to worry about that either. As I mentioned in my intro video, I am using leather for my outer sole, and I'm going to have some felt for my inner sole. And to cut out my leather sole, what I'm doing is taking my blue painter's tape, and I am just going to tape my pattern down onto the leather. This, you want to, if you're doing this, you want to double check that your tape won't leave any residue on your leather. I've done this before with this leather and this tape, so I know it won't, so I'm not worried about that. But as you can see, I'm just making little loops of tape and sticking them to the back of my pattern, and then I'm going to just stick that with the tape right onto my leather. This is from the edge of my piece of leather, so it's not in quite the best shape. But again, since it's going to be a slipper sole, I am not really worried that there are some slight markings and scratches in the leather surface. To transfer my pattern to the leather, what I'm doing is I am taking one of my sharper awls, I have several, and I am just very gently tracing around as close to the edge as possible around the edge of my paper pattern. And this is why I wanted a heavier paper than just standard printer paper, because I don't want to accidentally tear the pattern as I'm tracing it with my awl like this. It's a little hard to see in the video, but I now have a scratched outline on my leather. I am going to use a pair of scissors for this. Please don't yell at me. Yes, I realize these are gingers, but they are specifically for cutting non-fabric. These are not my fabric scissors, I promise. But they are actually really good for cutting leather because they are nice and sharp. I do a mix of leather, or I use a mix of tools depending on what I can find often for my leather, whether it is scissors or an X-Acto knife, or occasionally I will use my rotary cutter if all I'm doing is cutting straight lines and long strips. If I were going to make my outer sole out of a vinyl or a fake leather, I would cut it out with the same technique. I would probably just leave the pattern taped to it. I wouldn't necessarily scratch it with the awl, but I would still cut it out with scissors. The most important thing is to not use pins on either leather or a vinyl because they will leave permanent marks and holes in your leather. Cutting out the felt is pretty straightforward. I am just, cutting around the edge of my pattern. Now let's talk assembly and turn shoes and all that kind of serious stuff for a second. Because this is meant to be just an indoor slipper, lightweight, not going to go through any stress, I am not going to assemble this as a standard turn shoe. This is a slipper sole I have already done the work for another pair of slippers I am working on. As you can see, it had a lot more work put into it. I punched holes in it. I am not doing that for these slippers. So this is basically a cheater method. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my upper to my felt rather than to the leather. And it makes life so much easier. If you are feeling really adventurous, you can sew it directly to the leather. I didn't want to do that because I didn't want the roll of the slipper as it goes around the edge to then rub on the floor. So that's also part of the reason why I opted to use this method. If I were doing a two-layered leather sole, then I would, with both the inner and the outer sole as leather, then I would be sewing my slipper upper to the leather. But we're not doing that for this. So as you can see, I am pinning my slipper upper onto my felt. I have the right side of my slipper upper to my felt, and the wrong side is on the outside, and I am just matching the center front and center back, double checking to make sure I've got the correct center back, and I kind of eased / mushed the front points of the upper to the front corners or points of the felt. I do want a little extra bit of give there just so there is room for my toes. But otherwise this is a pretty straightforward process. As you can see, I was lazy and I did not deal with my yarn ends, which I really should have. To attach this to sew these two together, what I am going to do is just sew a very, very narrow backstitched seam. And when I say narrow, I'm trying to keep it about 1/8 of an inch. I really don't want to do any wider than that because then I will lose a significant amount of width from my sole, and also I will start to lose from width or height from my upper as well. So I am just backstitching through basically the very edge of the ribbed work, kind of catching both that and the row of single crochet I did around the outside just to neaten it up. If you are very careful and if your machine can handle it, it is possible to machine sew this, but I didn't want to try and fight such a narrow seam allowance through my sewing machine, so I didn't bother. It was just easier to do this by hand myself. Once that is done, I am going to turn my shoe right side out, and then I'm going to put on the leather outer sole. The method I am going to use for this is by gluing it on with a rubber cement, which is my favorite glue for doing leather work, because you do have a little bit of time where it is somewhat positionable, but then once it dries, it's not going anywhere. So I am just really quickly making sure everything lines up nicely. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little sewing clips, and I'm going to clip my leather to my slipper, and to make sure again that everything is lined up properly. And then I'm going to glue it in phases. So basically I've got half of my sole clipped into place, and then I'm going to start gluing from the middle of the slipper towards the heel. I specifically have Elmer's Craft Bond rubber cement, but there are a bunch of different kinds. So with rubber cement, what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit on each side. So I'm putting glue on the leather and on the felt, and I want to make sure that I get a nice amount of glue on there. And I am pressing it together, and then I'm also making sure that my heel is still lined up as I start, before I put the glue on the heel. And then I'm going to stick that down, clip it into place, and then start with the other half. It's really easy with the felt to also see and make sure you make sure you don't have any little air bubbles or spots where there is no glue, because if you do and you see it right away, you can still gently peel it off and fix that. But once it sits for even as short as a few minutes, it'll basically be too late to fix it. So once again, as I said, glue on both sides or both pieces that are getting stuck together, and then I'm just going to continue as I go to add more glue and continue to line up and stick my sole onto my slipper. I am moving fairly quickly. Some glues you have to go a little bit quicker than other glues. Several years ago I took a leather working class, and we had a much heavier type of cement. It wasn't just rubber cement. It was a hardcore contact cement that was positionable a lot longer than rubber cement is. That was also a glue that was so serious we had to use a fume hood for it. We weren't allowed to have an open container in class because it was such a hardcore glue. And then my camera battery died, so there is a slight gap in footage here. But regardless, what I've done is I've turned the shoe inside out, clipped it into place, and then I've left it for preferably 24 hours, but at least 12, just to make sure the glue has really set. So I left my slipper to dry, and it's now the next day, and while it is nominally finished, I do want to do a little bit more work on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little what would have been called a beading chain or a beading row, basically so that I can put a drawstring into my slipper, because I want the top of the slipper to not gap when I'm wearing it, basically. So all I've done is I started 2 stitches above where my side piece ends, and all I'm going to do is chain 2 and then a double crochet into the center of each stripe. To finish, I am just going to stitch that final, I'm gonna pull out that final chain, thread my yarn needle again, and then I'm just gonna stitch it through the spot on the vamp where the other one, mirroring the other side, and then I'm just going to finish it off by knotting it in and then burying my thread or my yarn end. For the drawstring itself, I am just going to use some natural colored 3/8 inch cotton tape that I have, and I'm just going to weave it through that beading row that I just made. And once it's done, I can tie it into a nice bow, either on the outside of the shoe, or if I want, I can tuck that in under the tongue so no one actually sees the ends of my tape, but that is, you know, personal choice when I'm wearing it. If I want in the future, I can add some more trim to this. Some of the patterns featured a scalloped edge along the outside or along the upper edge. One of the patterns also featured the tongue folded down. I would recommend tacking that if you do want to do it just that way, just to make sure it stays there. One pattern had ribbon that was pleated and sewn down to the upper edge rather than a crocheted edge. So honestly, there are a lot of different ways this could go. If you participated in this crochet along, thank you guys so much. I really hope you had fun making these slippers. I had a lot of fun making them myself. If you remember from the last video, I'm also making another pair for my friend Robin and of So Loud. And there are a couple other differently shaped crocheted slipper patterns, one of which I'm also experimenting with. So there'll be a video about that eventually too. But yeah, again, I just want to thank you all. If you've participated or if you followed along, please, you know, share photos with me on Instagram. Let me know. It doesn't matter when you do this. I still want to know because it's fun sharing stuff like this. If you really enjoyed this, please subscribe. I will be doing more crochet alongs and knit alongs for other projects in the future. I don't know what's coming up next. I haven't decided yet. I have a couple different plans, but stuff like that I will talk about on my Instagram, and hopefully sometime soon I will hit 1,000 subscribers so I can have a community tab here on YouTube, which will also make life a lot easier to talk to you guys. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Check me out on Instagram. If you want to give me a little treat, I have my coffee link down below as well. And I will see you guys again soon. Bye.